This panel is called Activism, Identity, and Social Justice in the US and Europe. I'm sure many of you have heard of Elie Weisel, who was 15 years old when he entered Auschwitz in 1944. He survived over a year of grueling conditions and wrote about his experience in his book, Night. He won the Nobel Prize in 1986 for his humanitarian work and activism, and in his acceptance address, he said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." End quote. The following panel will discuss this topic of protest in all of its forms and is entitled Activism, Identity, and Social Justice in the United States and Europe. Our first speaker is Charlton Mckeon, an NYU professor of media, culture, and communications, whose current research focuses on digital media and racial justice activism. He has written 2 books on the subject and is currently working on a 3rd. His talk today is entitled Black Lives Matter, Context, Controversies, Appropriations. Let's give him a warm welcome to NYU Florence.
Good morning. Thanks to all of you for being here. I know you didn't have much choice, but thank you anyway. The Washington Post year-long project to track police shootings generated a final tally of 986 people shot and killed by police in 2015. Quoting from their report, the vast majority of these shot and killed by police were armed, and half of them were white. Still, police killed blacks at 3 times the rate of whites when adjusted for the population where those shootings occurred. And although black men represent 6% of the U.S. population, they made up nearly 40% of those who were killed while unarmed. This, of course, frames, in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement. What is Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter is a statement. It is a hashtag. It is an organization. For some, it represents just a moment in history. For others, it is a movement for black lives, that many call it. The movement is digital, but the movement's participants resist calling it a, quote, digital movement. But I want to focus my remarks today at this intersection, the images of Black Lives Matter and the digital context in which they are produced, reproduced, and circulated. I focus on some of the controversies these images produce and the ways in which they have been appropriated to create a narrative that propels the movement. Black Lives Matter is popularly referred to as the new civil rights movement, but the movement's images and the narrative it has created belies this sense of new. The historian Jacqueline Hall reminds us that stories, as many of my colleagues have already mentioned, are political, and attempts to reframe the connection between the past and present can and often do have dangerous political consequences. And so I want to see the images today, specifically in relation to how we imagine and reimagine the long struggle for racial justice. The digital images conjured, produced, and circulated in the digital environment imagines connections to, rather than separation from, yesteryear's civil rights struggles. They focus on visible black bodies, active, animated, and in the streets. Some see images like this one from Ferguson, from Baltimore, from Oakland, and elsewhere as destruction, but these images reframe it as a cleansing, a necessary path to a society that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Am I next? The question recalls those who have gone before, those who have died before, who have been unjustly murdered before. Am I next speaks or views the black self in relationship to a particular historical trajectory in which erasure can always be seen as inevitable. It speaks to a history in which black voices have been silenced and the ways in which those voices somehow always find expression. Black Lives Matter aims to reframe and rearticulate history in a way that prioritizes and privileges the lives of victims and not their oppressors. And so many people see images like this and talk about vandalism or destruction, but it is about narrative, about a different reframing. And it casts a shadow on those who resist hearing Black voices and viewing Black bodies, choosing rather to make them invisible again in the sea of all lives. And so many of you remember the controversy stemming simply from the tagline, the name, Black Lives Matter, which is only controversial when it's removed from a historical context of disadvantage, and many of the things that my colleagues have spoken to earlier. And so we must topple the all so that a movement for Black lives can stand tall. And so what's interesting about the images that I look at here are that, as you can remember, we've seen this image before, right? And so these are not so much photographs as they are digitally manipulated images by people to communicate or to voice particular narratives. And here we see the addition of the All Lives Matter, a way of toppling this kind of statement in order to focus on the idea of Black lives and their worth. This lady perhaps says it best in her sign. Yes, all lives matter, but we're focused on the Black ones right now, okay? Just for a moment. Because it is very apparent that our judicial system does not know that. Plus, if you can't see why we're exclaiming Black Lives Matter, you are a part of the problem. But some would use Black Lives Matter to further other interests, to highlight so-called Black cultural deficiencies, to blame the victims, to exonerate systemic structures and systems for delivering unequal advantages and disadvantages exactly how they were originally designed. Some choose to talk about the injustice of unborn lives, where race and Blackness is used to marshal anything and everything but racial justice. And Black Lives Matter sells t-shirts. At the Black Portraitures Conference back at NYU, I gave a similar presentation in this slide, and afterwards someone came up to me and said, are you selling t-shirts? I said, no, I think you misunderstood. But this also begs the question, not only who runs Black Lives Matter, but who owns it. Black Lives Matter began with 3 young women who dared to articulate the worth of Black lives in the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The hashtag that marks their shirts was started by them, but then found resonance in a moment when the worth of Black lives was so viscerally called into question with Ferguson and the killing of Mike Brown. In Ferguson, Black Lives Matter began to be a louder clarion call. It began a new display and circulation of images that articulated not only what Black Lives Matter means in principle, but how Black Lives Matter reframes or frames the fundamental struggle of our time. These next few images I show you come from a Spencer Foundation-funded study that 2 other colleagues and I recently released in the last couple of weeks called Beyond the Hashtag. You can look it up online. It's about a 90-page report that chronicles the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly on Twitter and the wider web. And so we look at about 40 million plus tweets from the summer before Ferguson, through Ferguson, and on through our current moment. And one of the questions, of course, that endures in thinking about and talking about Black Lives Matter is, why now? Why has this movement sparked such energy and such visibility at this particular moment? And one of the conclusions that we arrive at, among many, is about the power of images. And so some of these images that I'll show over the next few slides are those that dominated the circulation in Twitter over a couple of years period. These images, number one, aim to crush the notion of racial progress, this idea of post-racial America, by imaging familiar scenes from 40, 50 years ago and the present, and making the connection that things have not changed. White cop calmly standing over a deceased black body tells the story in a nutshell. The crushing weight of police brutality and the state power that too often leaves black bodies lying lifeless in the streets while observers can do little more than bear witness. You can't see this very well, but this is the white police officer in Ferguson standing over Mike Brown's body, which, of course, lied in the street for hours before it was covered, before it was taken to a morgue. Images of dying parents and broken families that beg for peace, protest, and change. It is amazing how many circulated images stamped Black Lives Matter visualize black voices as those voices are extinguished. Every time you see me, you want to mess with me. I'm tired of it. It stops today. I'm minding my business, officer. I'm minding my business. Please just leave me alone. I told you the last time, please just leave me alone. Please. Please don't touch me. Do not touch me. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Many of you know these are the last words of Eric Garner. These images help us reconnect our past to our present and its common bond of slavery, lynchings, and the end of dreaming. Here we have a poem that was taken and shared as an image by a young poet who took the words, "I can't breathe," and reframed them into a poem using only those words. These images help us visualize black criminals as something other, as people with families and loved ones, obligations, and smiles. They help us wade through the images of black criminality so that we can see black innocence, vulnerability, and humanity. They help us visualize the sheer brutality of a system that can deliver death in as casual a manner as these men's shorts, t-shirts, and sneakers convey. They make us face up to harsh realities, to ask questions that our society seems to almost in every way answer in the affirmative. How much is this man's life worth to the team of soldiers that stand ready to snatch it away? So one of the images that really is enduring, or set of images that were most powerful in this particular movement, have to do with the militarization of police in black communities, most starkly in Ferguson. And so while it's never something that we could prove, I think there is evidence to suggest that one of those things that made Ferguson, in particular, such a visible and visceral event was the circulation of these kinds of images. Images that made people question in the way that Fannie Lou Hamer once questioned in 1964 when she said, "Is this America, the land of the free, the home of the brave?" And so many people saw these kinds of images on our streets and said, is this what we are really about as a nation? Most importantly of all, the images of Black Lives Matter help us visualize those who for so long were nameless, invisible, and forgotten. And so these images are from a group called Mapping Police Violence. And my colleague spoke a minute ago about not having statistics or census and so forth. And one of the aims of Mapping Police Violence was to begin to count and visualize groups of people who for so long were not documented. And those were these folks who were victims of police violence, who often don't have names, don't have images, are virtually unknown and invisible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Our next speaker is Arlene Davila. an anthropology professor at NYU. She's written 2 books and co-authored a 3rd on the subject of Latin America and Latino culture. Her talk is entitled Latinos and Race in the 21st Century. Let's give her a warm welcome, please.
So as I said, I'm going to stay here, but before I start, are there any Latinos in the house? Yes, I knew that. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to be very brief, 10 minutes counting. I want to talk about race and social movements and what I call neoliberal racialism in regard to Latinos, which may be, and the first thing we need to grapple is how do we think about Latinos and race, which is maybe kind of a tricky or complex issue, because let's start with the fact that Latinos are not a race, but a pan-ethnic group, which includes different racial makeups. We have Indo-Latinos, Afro-Latinos, white Latinos, Asian Latinos, and different shades. So that means that some of us are subject to different types of racializations, but also different levels of white privilege, and we need to account for that too. At the same time, Latinos are racialized as a race. We're not just like any other ethnic group in America. And this has been a big issue when thinking about Latinos, because in the context of dominant social sciences, is dominated in the context of the United States by the black and white binary. How do you put Latinos, right? But also by the dominant assimilation paradigm, which was defined in relationship to European immigrants. Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Eastern Europeans, Jewish Americans, which kind of assimilated into whiteness in the context of the United States. So a lot of, there's like this stack up to here of social science scholars still arguing to the forefront that, well, Mexicans are just like Italian Americans, just give them more time, they're going to assimilate. Of course, this is not true. We have as much and big and loud a voice highlighting the existence of racialization for Latinos. We have to remember that Italian Americans and European Americans didn't migrate to the context of the United States as subjects of empire, conquest, or colonization, as is the case with Latin American migrants. So that you really need to engage with the history of colonization, empire, and race. I find it very useful to think about Juan Gonzalez's metaphor of Latinos as the harvest of empire, and how you really need to engage with that if you're really going to understand where Latinos rate in this kind of dominant assimilation paradigm. So when thinking about Latinos and race, it helps us think about the variable of how culture, too, can become a variable of racialization. How one speaks, one language, one culture, but also the importance of nativism as key variable for racialization of Latinos. And this also happens in the context of Asian Americans, and I know we're going to hear about that in this panel. The idea that it doesn't matter if you're here in this country like most Mexican Americans, even before the United States was a United States nation, you're still considered a foreigner in your own land on account of your last name or on account of your accent. In the case of Puerto Ricans, we're all colonial subjects since 1917, and yet my accent will always have somebody prod me, where are you from, right? With the implication that you're not a citizen. So we need to really understand these kind of specificities about the racialization of Latinos, but also understand the importance of transnationalism and the transnational lenses in understanding our community. How Latinos in our community, according to generations and according to how long we've been in the United States, whether we've been here for generations or are more recent comers, we have a different understanding and awareness of race and racialization processes. So for instance, we have those, like our parents, who still have the Kool-Aid of mestizaje from Latin America, which they bring with us, and those that become racialized in the context of the United States when we grow up here and you see and you understand your Latinization as a racial subject in the context of the United States. Some of the blinders that we need to be very, very, very aware of in the Latino community is the preeminence of those transnational lenses, right? But also the currency of ethnicity and nationalism as an imaginary lens that we may use for kind of not think about racism. I'm not black. I'm not really like those Latinos, I'm Colombian, right? Or those, as I said, who still eat the Latin American mestizaje Kool-Aid. We Latinos are not racist, we're all mixed. We can't be racist, denying colorism and racism among Latinos. And actually, there's some very exciting research right now coming out of Latin America that is challenging that Kool-Aid of mestizaje by highlighting the existence of pigmentocracies. That is, that in the context of Latin America, no matter where you are, whether it's Brazil, Colombia, or whatever, you have actually a one-to-one correlation between your class, income, education, and the color of your skin. So while we may have these mestizaje ideologies that we're all mixed and we don't have racism, because we have all of these, ideologies, the existence of racism is very much real, and it's been documented more and more in the context of Latin America. So we have to really account for the ghost of white supremacy. The point is, in order to understand mestizaje, in other words, mestizaje is not a refuge for racism, but it's actually a shield that veils the existence of white supremacy in the Latin American community. And those of us who are very committed to anti-racist policies and politics need to be very, very vigilant about it. Another big caveat is the idea of nationality. My nationality has more cultural capital than yours. I'm Venezuelan. I'm not like those Dominicans or Puerto Ricans. Or class. I made it. Why can't those other Latinos make it too? Or citizenship. I'm a citizen. Let them get in line. If you remember Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, perfect example of what I'm talking about. A real terrible strand among US Latinos, especially those that deny the privilege of their own background that allowed for their preferential citizenship, like the case of Cubans, for instance, a preference that Mexicans do not have and never have had. And it was kind of embarrassing to see those Cuban Latino politicians claiming to be able to represent a community that they don't even understand. That's why when we think about Latinidad and Latinization, it's so important to recognize it as a social movement, as a praxis, but also being very aware of the incredible blinders that exist right now that seek to co-opt the Latino community. And Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio are very examples of this. What I called the neoliberal racializations of Latinos. And what do I mean with that? For the past years, I've been doing a lot of research on Latino commodification and what I call the Latino spin. The fact that in our community, because we are so, in order to challenge the idea of Latinos as criminals or Latinos as immigrants or Latinos as, we have had this other counter discourse that posit Latinos as basically the best thing that happened to the United States beyond Coca-Cola, right? Don't be scared of us. We're good consumers. Don't be scared of us. We're actually light-skinned. Don't be scared of us because we work hard. We have good families. We have traditional values. The values that America is losing, we're going to refurbish them through Ted Cruz. Don't laugh at this because my point here is that we are as complicit, we can be as complicit because these dominant good Latino images of model minorities are just as damaging, perhaps even more, because they present this kind of sanitized, complicit idea that corporate America can make profit from, right, as Latinos as consumers, without accounting for some of the issues that we heard in today's panel around human dignity, right? And equality, and how Latinos are going to be part of the problem if we buy into the neoliberal racializations that, we're squeaky clean Latinos, we're just going to be good, or are we going to really engage with anti-racist politics by becoming agents of anti-racism, agents against white supremacy? And that means being vigilant about white supremacy in our community, and also developing real alliances around some of the key issues of the times. Now, what are some of I have 1 minute, and I'm going to highlight 2 examples of social movements that are really exciting moments where you see these greater Latino movements apace. The Dream Movement, right, the Dreamers, which really made it, change the idea of illegal immigration, the fact that no human is illegal. Undocumented immigration is what we're talking about. And what's amazing about that group is how much they were able to do as an undocumented community through social media and by actually not being scared, undocumented, unafraid. This is so key for our community to learn, to get away from our fears. And secondly, the key fight against the banning of ethnic studies. As you know, there's an incredible backlash right now against ethnic studies, and it's so important for the Latino community to really fight and defend ethnic studies as a space of knowledge and to challenge the racist epistemology of our campuses. Because if we don't know our history, we're going to continue with the same problem. And ethnic studies, to me, is the best antidote to the mestizaje Kool-Aid and the best antidote to white supremacy. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So our next speakers are Evelyne Sarah Afaawua and Ian Elie Ssali Kiggundu. I hope I pronounced that right. Ms. Afaawua is founder of Nappytalia, a community and website inspired by her double identity as an Afro-Italian. She attended the TEDx Milano Women 2015 as speaker, and this year received the Youth Entrepreneurship Award and the African Italy Excellence Awards as Best Blogger. Joining her is Mr. Kiggundu, who is currently completing his law studies at Roma Tre University and also studies piano with M. Stefan Nerozzi here in Italy. He has joined Rete G2 Seconde Generazioni in 2007 and has been an active member promoting the organization's goals all over Italy. Please join me in welcoming our next speakers.
Hi to everyone. I'm really proud to be here today to represent Afro-Italians because we are the next generation here in Italy. I'm gonna tell you my story briefly to let you understand what it means to be a second generation. I was born in France. When I was 1 year old, my parents immigrated to Italy, where I was raised up to date. At 12, I flew to Ghana to learn English and my culture, returning to Europe at 16 years to continue my studies. Well, this adventure began 2 years ago with a Facebook page, Afro-Italian Nappy Girls, where Nappy means naturally and happy. After a personal crisis about my identity, based on my confusion about the mix of Italian and Ghanaian cultures I have, I decided to stop accepting the negative consideration society was giving to me. I refused to believe that the color of my skin were a limit to my personal skills, resulting in a lack of opportunities and laws that did not recognize my citizenship as Italian, even though I lived here for 24 years. I had to give up a lot of dreams, national and EU competition, journeys abroad, and even my education was compromised because of my Ghanaian passport. I've grown with a continued perception of being inferior due to my roots and black skin, up to the moment I realized I got a natural treasure, without even being aware of it, but rather trying to hide it. I understood I was the first who had to appreciate herself, my double identity, my skin, my hair, my body, and create added value out of my personal background, valorizing both cultures life have given to me. I decided to express this awareness in 2 ways. The first one was to define myself as Afro-Italian or Italo-Ghanaian, putting these 2 countries together on the same footing, especially by appreciating my physical appearance, by showing off my natural Afro hair, and no longer using relaxers. Using my hair to express my roots may seem like a strange way, but being a woman, I think aesthetic is an important way to develop self-confidence and reveal my new consciousness. I discovered a new me, a new curly and kinky hair, difficult to care for at the beginning. So I relied on the web to find information on how to cater to my Afro hair. Every source was in English and French. There was nothing in Italian, the language I use on a daily basis. I then asked myself, am I the only girl in Italy who is proud of her natural hair and roots? That's the reason why I created the Facebook page. From the start, there was much participation on the page related to the practical side of natural Afro hair care, but the cultural side was missing. So I decided to write an essay entitled, "Who Am I?" explaining my journey, and it was a success. Many Afro-Italian girls and boys, even with relaxed hair, could recognize themselves in this double identity crisis, causing them to reflect on their roots and begin to be more conscious about their identity, culture, appearance, and effects of relaxers and bleaching creams. A journalist from Corriere della Sera read the essay, and she was astonished by the simplicity of my words in explaining so broad concepts. And she decided to shoot a short film about my personal journey and the natural hair movement in Italy. This was just the beginning of a long journey. Just after 6 months opening the page, I decided that we needed a proper space to give room to Black beauty discussions in Italian. So I created Nappytalia, the first website in Italian where anyone could find information about natural Afro hair care. On my blog, you will read about the stories of other girls, the history of Afro hair, and stories of nappy celebrities. What I really care most about is to let second generation of immigrants know more about their roots, history, but especially their own African heritage, which could be missing if they are not educated about it and not accepting it. On the other hand, I want Black girls and boys to be inspired to be able to achieve everything they want. That's why in January 2015, I opened my e-shop to sell products related to Afro hair, since we can't find them here in Italy. I want different prices, and I hope to create my personal product line for my hair in order to get products for myself and be able to be contemplated in the society here. Italian mass media got really impressed on the treasure behind Nappytalia, giving me a wide platform on various national beauty magazines like Donna Moderna and Gioia to talk about beauty of Blackness and acceptance and celebration of our natural beauty, giving society a clear and positive sign of what we can achieve if we want. I took part in a web series, Rete, shot by Antonia, an Afro-American filmmaker who wanted to understand how Black beauties was seen around the world. I had the honor to be a speaker at the TEDx Milano Women 2015 to create awareness of a new generation of Black Italians, but rather to spread a broader message about acceptance. My voice was so loud, I presented my project to the Italian Minister of Labor and Social Policy as they recognize the change Nappytalia is bringing in the mind and heart of Italian, foreigners, Afro-Italian, and everyone who used to ignore the positive side of immigration in Italy. 2015 ended with the title as Best Blogger. A lot has been done in these only 2 years. I use her as a means to carry a broader message related to acceptance, accepting natural Afro hair, dark skin, refusing to change ourselves to be accepted in society, so saying no to one standard of beauty. Keeping our natural hair is a message to encourage Black women to be self-confident and aware of this beauty. Showcasing to Italian society that being Black does not determine our destinies, intelligence, or skills, but rather creating our own opportunities, even if they are not there. Thank you.
First of all, I'm really honored to be able to speak in front of you. My name is Ian. I am the legal representative of Rete G2 Seconde Generazioni, which is an organization which is funded by a group of young people whose roots lie in different cultures and countries. And, well, this group, let's say that started in 2005, and after some meetings in the train station, in the Termini train station in Rome, and by a group of young people. And they all share the same problems. I mean, they discovered this through these meetings. I mean, first of all, they were not Italian citizens. Second, that they had a green card stating at date of entrance their birthday, not kidding. And they were not able to vote, and of course, because if you are not Italian citizens, you can't. It is a problem when you are young, because you cannot travel around Europe, especially when you were born or raised since you were very little, and this is the only environment you are used to and you feel familiar with. So these were the problems, and we tried to tackle all of them. And first of all, we are an organization that is really committed in reforming the Italian citizenship law. These are the group of friends, and there is also me in the middle, the tall one. That's the reason why I'm not there. And yes, okay, this is where we go to talk to politicians and advise them about what we think the law should tackle. Because there are many hurdles, there are many obstacles, at least they were previously, because before asking the citizenship law, you had just 1 year to collect a lot of documents proving that you have been residing in Italy since you were born, and that actually is a very demanding task. And one thing that I must say, especially after hearing all the speakers, first of all, that the Professor Matthias Mosques is completely right about the perception of racism, discrimination, because here in Italy, that is exactly what we found very difficult. There is a lot of confusion between racism and discrimination. I mean, from my understanding, racism is just when there are institutions set in place aimed at oppressing, exploiting the labor of a specific, of a human being for its characteristic, which is completely different from discrimination, which is a natural behavior of treating someone differently, which is not bad as long as this is, because the diversity, it is not bad. Of course, when you see in this a difference, it can be bad. But even that, it is something that it depends on ideologies and everything. And here in Italy, there has not been, as in the United States, a long-lasting institutions oppressing certain groups or certain human beings. And that's actually something that Italians are quite ignorant about, because they don't know about the Jim Crow laws, they don't know about the slave codes, they don't know about the postcards about lynching that were exchanging for a lot of time. I mean, all these things were completely unknown. Were really unknown. So when they use the term racism, it is not actually the right term. It is all about discrimination, that I can tell you that there are many other aspects in the Italian society that we should tackle, because must be also, it is also important to acknowledge that Italy was conquered many times in its history by the Austrians, by the Arabs, by the Turks. But I mean, it is a country that has suffered. This is the Italian history, and so in this sense, we try to bring a change, because second generations, even if I hate this label, yes, it is not something that I completely agree with, but yes, we are trying to bring our person outside in the public sphere, under the national limelight, in order to let the people know that we exist. We are Italians, and actually no one ignores that, or at least they criticize us about that. But of course, legally speaking, that is an issue. And quickly, this is one of our main goals, being an active actor in the Italian society, spreading new ideas still in the Chamber of Deputies, and of course going to schools, because the identity problem is it is very sensitive, because, I mean, you are questioned at your very foundations whenever there is a person asking you, where are you from? Especially when there is not a strong narrative. And I'm talking also about, I am of African origin, and I can tell you that coming from most of sub-Saharan countries are not literate societies, so many things were just told and some things were forgotten. And that actually created a lot of issues, and the reason why it is much more popular, the history of the Afro-Americans compared to the one of Africans. But this is something that I will be very happy to discuss with everyone interested in. But we go into the schools also to show to, not to people that have foreign origins, but even other Italians that are local and everything, at least to show someone that they can connect with. That is fundamental in order to have a change, instead of just talking about that uselessly. I mean, we are here, we are doing something, and we are going into one direction. And connecting this heritage with quality. We are very committed with that. And so we go to school, we meet children, and that actually is one of our main activities. And it's something that, if I have to tell something personal, it puts me a smile on my face. But, and then we see who is confused by the bureaucracy, because it is not. I mean, Italy, I mean, legally speaking, it is very democratic because it creates problems to everyone. It doesn't matter. I mean, so this is, let's say, something that we all share. But we are all committed in changing for the better, and that actually is something that I really like and I really love of this country. And yeah, we communicate through Facebook, to the webpage, the secondagenerazioni.it, and our Facebook page. And I'm sorry if I was not very articulated as other speakers. We are running out of time. I really wish to have more time in order to address many other points that I really wanted to talk about, but I don't know if someone was interested, but I will be somewhere here, so feel free to approach me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to introduce our last speaker, and as a young Asian American New Yorker whose grandparents immigrated to New York in the 1970s and 1980s, I'm particularly excited to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Lee Wong, who will be discussing the culture and identity formation of Asian Americans in the 70s and 80s. Mr. Wong is a writer and exhibition organizer in New York and the managing director of Kudaman and visiting scholar at the APA Institute at NYU. He's organized exhibitions, served the people, the Asian American movement in New York, and has worked as a program director of the Asian American Writers Workshop, assistant curator at the Museum of Chinese in America, as well as being an exhibition administrator at the Metropolitan Museum. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wong.
Hello, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to the conference organizers. I'm very happy to be back in Firenze. I did my undergrad semester abroad in Bologna. I really encourage all of you to go if you haven't been yet. The churches are less pretty, but the restaurants are better. I just thought I should say something controversial. I think we haven't had enough. Can we do a poll for that one? The food is better in Florence or Bologna. I'm here to suggest to you today that what you were taught, what I was taught about Asian America is deeply, shockingly incomplete. And most of what we are told through mass media and culture is actually wrong, false. And I'm going to do that by looking at the early history of that term. Does anyone know when that term came into being? Any guesses? It wasn't until 1968, and the 60s seem to be the topic of the day. So keep in mind what else was going on in 1968. And contrary to popular belief, it also came out of student movements. People who were between the ages of 17 and 25 invented the term Asian America as a political identity in the late 60s. So by looking at this movement, what does Asian America mean today? We get some ideas by visiting this history. Asia is half the world. It's everything between the Balkans and the Pacific, from Russia down to Antarctica. We're talking about billions of people. So what does Asian America mean? And I'm going to suggest to you today that it actually doesn't mean anything unless we make it an intentional identity, unless we find some common idea of what liberation means to us. To borrow the indelible phrase from Angela Davis, it must be an identity that is not a politics based on identity, but an identity based on politics. And so in this early moment of trying to figure out what Asian America could be, we had very different strategies. I'm going to focus on the culture of the movement. On the left, we had people really regurgitating the stereotypes they had been taught about what Asian America is. You see the Fu Manchu, the opium smoker, the barbarian. On the right, other people thought that the best strategy was to present a positive image of Asian America. The artist Tomio Rai actually had to clip out magazines that were printed in Vietnam to make this image in a silkscreen because she couldn't find any images of Asians in America that weren't racist. So what was going on in 1968 that prompted this outpouring of cultural activity? In America, you had the Black liberation movement, especially the Black Panthers, who were deeply influential, the anti-war movement, the New Left, and of course, feminism and women's liberation. But then, especially for Asian America, you had people looking at what else was going on in the world. The Cultural Revolution in China, which at that time was actually not very understood. People really glorified it. The war in Vietnam, the movement against imperialism in the Philippines, and then, of course, all of the post-colonial movements in Latin America and Africa. So I started to do some research to just find out what happened during this movement because it wasn't in my textbooks. And a lot of it is buried in archives, a lot of it is through newspapers that I had to look at. But what I found was this deeply different image of what Asian America was. This iconic image of kind of the revolutionary Asian woman with the machine gun was one of the most popular of this time period. The idea was, as you can see on the right, that you would be reading your little red book in one hand, caring for a baby, and then fighting with a machine gun for the revolution all at the same time. I think a very different image than what we're given of what Asian America means today. There was a lot of pent-up anger and frustration with America's racial order that came out during the movement. On the left, you see one of the biggest protests in Asian American history. It took place in 1975 in New York. A 27-year-old engineer named Peter Yu was witnessing a traffic arrest. He was beaten by the police and arrested. What you had was a lot of pent-up frustration with multiple incidents of police brutality against Asian Americans, bottled up for many, many decades, if not over a century, coming out into this massive protest in 1975. This is a famous image by Corky Lee that I think really speaks to the energy and excitement. And you had 20,000 Asian Americans, mostly Chinese, out in the streets, really speaking out against police brutality. Bridge was one of the main magazines during this era. It was a mix of art and politics and culture where they would review movies and publish fiction. And I chose these two images together because of that motif of the scream, of this idea of being so upset for so long and finally having an outlet through movement work. Culture and cultural production, I think, is always important to any sort of social movement and any kind of identity formation. These are examples from Basement Workshop on the left, which was another art space in New York where people would go on Saturday nights to print the flyers for the rallies the next day. But they would also just do kind of DIY culture. So you could take a film workshop class, you had choreographers doing dance workshops. It was a very exciting and energizing place that started the careers of a lot of Asian American artists. Some of those artists on the right, Al Robles, Jessica Hagedorn of the book Dog Eaters. A lot of these great Asian American voices got their start doing political work. So I think, the next panel is on arts and activism. I would argue that there's actually often no separation between the two. The most well-known cultural object during this period was an album called A Grain of Sand, and they were kind of an American folk rocky group that traveled around the country. And they would put critiques of imperialism and white supremacy into these kind of soft, catchy, like American folk rock music. It's kind of not a popular style today, but I encourage you to go back and listen. You can find it online. Everyone who was part of the Asian American movement saw these people perform. They went to every community center, every college campus with an Asian American student body that wanted to invite them. And they also, of course, gave concerts for free. This is one down in Chinatown. There was also a deep investment and interest in radical politics. So I mentioned that the Asian American movement was deeply inspired by the Black Panthers. I think you can really see that in the object on the left. This was a group called Iwar Kun, which means righteous fists. 1971, for those of you who know the Lunar New Year calendar, was the year of the pig. Here it's the year of the people off the pig. That's the police, for those of you who don't know. And again, fighting police brutality, really articulating radical politics through that. Like the Black Panthers, Iwar Kun published a 10-point program. A lot of them wore berets, a lot of them marched with firearms. On the right, another one of those groups having this really intense revolutionary theory debate with Iwar Kun. So there's this idea that comes from Lenin that in order to be at the vanguard of the revolution, you needed to have the right theories. So all of these groups would have these really intense, long, theoretical debates about how to get to the revolution. And a lot of people actually believed in revolution in their lifetimes, that you would see the end of the American government. That, of course, didn't happen, but that sort of revolutionary energy, that excitement, propelled a lot of this Asian American movement. So within the Asian American movement, there was a blending of the women's liberation movement and the Asian movement, because a lot of Asian women rightfully saw that there was this double, triple oppression of being marginalized not only within the women's movement, which was mostly white at the time, but also within the Asian American movement, which was very masculine dominated. So here again are two very different strategies to talk about that. On the left, the sort of soft, nurturing image by the artist Nancy Hom. On the right, this famous image from Ghidra. They were a newspaper that published a special issue about Asian women, which is literally just giving the finger to Asian dudes. So two very different strategies for talking about this double oppression. If I could leave you with one last note, especially for those of you who identify as Asian American, but I think for anyone who's grappling with these questions of identity and culture and social movements, is that identity is not something that is fixed, but that is something you find through the work you do, through the movements you join, through the art you make, through the way you talk to people. And these people who created the very concept of Asian America were your age. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.